think of the collective unconscious as this. It's not the collective unconscious. There is nothing that is unconscious. Everything that is in consciousness. By consciousness, I mean the single infinite medium of mind, out of which each of our finite minds crystallizes. So although the finite mind crystallizes out of or within this field of infinite mind, at its origin, the finite mind, all finite minds are connected. Although once they have taken their full shape, they seem to be separate.
Yes.
Like Jane's experience and Claire and Peter and John in the dream, they each seem to have their own separate individual minds. Each of their four minds are a crystallization of Claire's infinite mind. Yes. So at their origin, their minds are connected.
Yes.
And love is one of the ways that we intuit this deep connection, that what we appear to be is a separate body and a separate mind. Yes. But if we trace back to the origin of that separate body and mind, it becomes less and less separate the further back we go.
Yes.
It's only in the waking state that it is at its most separate.
Yes.
As we begin to trace our way back to the origin of the mind, and we go back through the states, first of all through the dream state, things are much less separate in the dream state than they are in the waking state.
Yes.
And then as we go further back, that it is, as it were, the finite mind is decrystallizing.
Yes.
It's dissolving back into the infinite field of mind out of which it crystallized. So it crystallizes, it takes a separate name and form, nama-rupa. And then as it decrystallizes, the name and form becomes less and less clear. And the less clear the name and form, the less distinction there is between the two selves. They go back.
Yes.
So what is commonly called the collective unconscious is that part of the mind, that part of the infinite field of mind that has not yet completely crystallized out into two separate forms. In other words, it is shared.
Yes.
Now, the reason that we don't experience that in the waking state is not because it has gone out of consciousness and is residing in some other place called the unconscious. No, it still exists in consciousness, but as consciousness focuses its attention more and more, its focus becomes narrower, name and form becomes clearer and clearer, and the what is called the unconscious is everything that is eclipsed.
Yes.
By the focus of our attention in the waking state. As a friend of mine put it, it's like the stars at midday. We're still, when you look up at the sky, the stars are exactly where they were last night, more or less. Yeah, yeah. The stars don't all disappear out of the sky during the day. They stay exactly where they are. But because of the brightness of the sun's light,
Yes.
it seems that we are no longer seeing them. They seem to have gone out of existence.
Yes, I see.
Because the sun's light in this case is a metaphor for the brightness of the waking state.
Yes.
So it is the brightness of the waking state, the focus of the waking state, that eclipses everything that we have access to in the dream state and in the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. They're not unconscious. It's just that the focus of the waking state mind eclipses them, so we seem not to be aware of them.
I see.
That is why it's this beautiful poem by Wordsworth that I'm sure many people know it, and he describes this process. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. When he says our birth, it's what he's describing can be applied to many different timescales. It can be applied to the timescale of a human birth. It can be applied to 24 hours of coming into the waking state and going out again. It can be applied to the rising of a perception and the dissolution of a perception. So this poem can be applied on many different timescales. He applies it over the lifetime of a person. I think of it more as a 24-hour cycle. I think of it more not so much as our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting, but rather the waking state is but a sleep and a forgetting. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So pardon?
I coughed. I don't know if that was...
Yeah. So he says our birth, or the waking state, is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul, the ego, our life's star that rises with us, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar. But not in entire forgetfulness, nor in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory, do we come from God, which is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. And then he describes this narrowing of awareness. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy, but he beholds the light, and whence it comes, he sees it in his joy. The youth, and then getting more and more, the youth who daily farther from the east, pure awareness, the youth who daily farther from the east must travel, still is nature's priest, and by the vision splendid is on his way attended. At last the man perceives it fade away. At last the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day, into the waking state. So he describes this. Trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, which is our home. The soul, our life's star that rises with us, the separate self, the soul, rises, but it rises out of God's infinite being. It's it precipitates or rises out of God's infinite being, but it comes saturated with God's presence. Trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, which is our home, and not in entire forgetfulness, nor in utter nakedness. In other words, the self has this memory of its eternity embedded within it. And that is why all separate selves, as long as we feel we are a separate self, we long to return home. That's the desire for happiness, the desire for love, the desire for intimacy, not in entire forgetfulness, nor in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, which is our home. And then he begins to describe this narrowing of awareness, this what in India is called ignorance, the ignoring of our true nature, that the apparent, and it's only apparent of course, the apparent turning away. Awareness ceases gazing at itself. It rises in the form of the finite mind, and only as the finite mind it turns away from itself and looks outwards. It's called the fall in the Christian tradition. Looks outwards, away from its source, towards objects. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. But still there is this memory, but he beholds the light, and whence it comes. He sees it in his joy. He sees it in his joy. In his happiness is his way of connecting, is the child's way of... The experience of happiness in the child is its experience of its home, God's infinite being. And then the youth who daily farther from the east must travel. This is he calls it the youth, but it would be where we're in the dream state now, where awareness is narrowing, and therefore everything that is outside the narrow its narrow focus seems to be missing. It is eclipsed by the brightness, the light of common day. So this explains why, for instance, a very commonly asked question. In fact, it was the first question I ever asked Francis, and when I asked him the question, he said, that was the last question I ever asked my teacher. And I know many people in this room have asked this question before. If I am infinite consciousness, why can I not know what is going on in everybody else's mind? It's a very good question. And the reason is that in order to have precipitated as the finite mind, in order to have taken the shape of the finite mind, in order to know the world, consciousness has had to cease knowing its own being as it is. It has had to narrow the focus of its knowledge. In other words, it has had to exclude or forget everything that is outside the envelope of the finite mind. That is why, from the finite mind's point of view, we cannot know what's going on in somebody else's mind. That's why Jane doesn't know what's going on in John's mind, although both Jane and John's mind are both made of and appearing in and known by the same infinite consciousness. So it is a kind of forgetting. The waking state is a narrowing or a forgetting. And it has to be like that.
Yes,
in order for objects to come into apparent existence, there has to be a forgetting or an apparent ignoring of the infinite reality.
I see that very clearly now, Rupert. The whole thing seems to make sense, and it strikes me as if there's no problem whatsoever with being the modality of a particular
absolutely
mind.
Yes.
But the only problem, if you can term it thus, that occurs is when there's an identification with the mind such that it's
with the limitation, yes,
forgotten of its source. There's an identification with something that is really almost a tool for experiencing variety.
Yes. In order to experience variety, in other words, in order to experience a world, consciousness has to seem to overlook the knowing of its own infinite being. In other words, to know something finite, a person, an object, a thought, a feeling. To know something finite, infinite consciousness has to seem to cease being infinite, because something that is infinite cannot know something that is finite. And so the way consciousness seems to cease being infinite is to simultaneously create and identify itself with the body. Claire, sleeping in her bed, forgets the nature of her own mind and simultaneously creates and identifies herself with Jane's mind. It's only in the form of Jane's mind that she can know the streets of London. In other words, a finite object.
Yes.
So all that's necessary is for Jane to realize that the knowing with which she knows her finite experience doesn't belong to her body. It is not generated by her body.
Yes.
Her body is a localization of Claire's infinite mind. Sorry, of Mary, thank you. Thank you, of Mary's infinite mind.
Yes,
That knowledge doesn't mean that Jane ceases to see the appearance of finite objects, the streets of London. She continues to see the streets of London. But in other words, it's not Maya or illusion. That is the illusory appearance that the streets of London are real, made out of matter. It's not Maya that disappears. It's ignorance that disappears. There's a difference.
Yes.
Maya continues, but ignorance goes.
Yes.
The ignorance is I, Jane, am a separate, finite consciousness. That ignorance goes. In other words, Jane realizes I am not Jane. I am Mary. I am essentially Mary.
Yes.
I am not the finite mind that is identical to the body. I am essentially God's infinite being. And all of our finite minds are modulations of that infinite being. That's all that's necessary to know and feel. If we take that thought deeply and ponder it, and then allow that thought to gradually infiltrate the way we think, the way we feel, the way we act, the way we relate, and the way we perceive. That's it.
That's a perfect answer, Rupert. Thank you. And it's reminding me as you're talking of when my mum died about 5 years ago, and obviously in ensuing months there was grief. But my very, very first thought that I had, which was more of a feeling than a thought, was that as though, I can stop playing badminton, sort of lobbing communication over a net. You know, as though every communication I'd had to lob it over a net, and the net had fallen, and now there was a deeper.
Yes.
What we were was apparent,
Yes.
although I didn't put it into words. It was just almost like relief at not having to play badminton anymore with words.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. That might be my last question too, but I doubt it somehow.
You see, Jung was really onto something with his idea about the collective unconscious, but I don't feel that he had the whole picture. But he was on the right track. His intuition was absolutely spot on.